This is Brent Richardson, and welcome to the Business Minutia Podcast, where our focus is on the details of business that are often passed over by traditional classes and leadership training. We focus on the stories of real people who have tried, failed, and learned through their experiences and are willing to share their lessons with others.
Brent, when we decided to buy this house, we were in for a shock when we went and got my credit score. Do you remember that?
Yes. We're talking about identity theft.
Oh, it was crazy, and had no idea that it happened several years before. Somebody in Houston had taken my identity and started electricity in a house, and couldn't find them, couldn't figure out what to do with it. It ended up just screwing the whole thing.
Well, how about my identity theft, where I had
Well,
I got a credit card in the mail from, I think, Sam's Club with my name on it and some other dude's picture. And some guy in California had gotten a hold of my identification and was running wild.
The difference between yours and mine is we learned from mine.
Yeah, well.
And we ended up getting a company that ended up helping us out, and they were able to start pinging us and let us know as soon as the identity
And
was
you don't
stolen.
think any of these things are ever going to happen until they do. And then I think it was John Goodman from Big Lebowski going, am I the only one who cares about the rules?
And there are rules, and we need people that follow the rules that
Right.
can help us with the rules. What does this have to do with today's episode?
Well, when you run into those kinds of things, all of a sudden you need somebody that's a specialist in those areas. And we're talking about legal. What happens when businesses and whether small or medium or large, run into problems where they need legal counsel? And so we've been searching out for who's a good legal counsel we can give as a recommendation and an interview to understand a little bit what should small businesses be worried about and be concerned about when it comes to legal matters.
In a previous interview of ours, Jane was able to actually connect us with one of her friends who is an amazing attorney for small businesses. Her name is Jessica Vittorio, and she actually she has her own firm, and she just focuses on small and medium-sized businesses.
Yes, and she's very charismatic. A great speaker. It was a great interview. Lots to learn from this. It's easy to listen to. And, whether maybe you don't need legal counsel right this minute. Hopefully you don't. You don't want to be doing this reactively.
Right.
But, something to keep in mind. There's a lot of cool things in here that you probably didn't think about that you go, yeah, I probably need to have somebody on speed dial here.
If you are driving or you are working out or whatever it is you're doing, just know this is a more than one time listen. You're not going to get it all the first time through because we speed run through all the big questions that we're always asked.
Yeah, the stuff you'd want to ask a lawyer
Yes.
when it comes to small business. So we hit it all. It's a lot of content. Enjoy, folks.
So I decided I was going to be a lawyer in middle school. I did mock trial and fell in love with the courtroom and never reconsidered that decision in my true stubborn nature. And so flash forward, I went to Southwestern for undergrad. I have a BA in political science, which is kind of classic lawyer. I swear most of the people at law school have a BA in poli-sci, and went to Baylor for law school. And I specifically chose Baylor because of their reputation for producing very good trial attorneys. And I thought I wanted to do trial law, and I got into Baylor and realized I did not want to do trial law. But I'm still very grateful for Baylor's program. I feel like I was a much more prepared lawyer when I graduated because of kind of the rigor of their program. And so I was doing energy and environment while I was in school and once I got out, and I thought that's what I was going to do and realized I just found it to be really, really boring. So I had a background in politics before going to law school. I had worked in the Texas House and I'd worked for a lobbying agency, and got an offer to go to Washington, D.C. and serve as chief legislative counsel for a member of the U.S. House. So I moved up to Washington, D.C. for 2 years right after I graduated law school, and did that for a little while. And then I really enjoyed it. Federal politics is such a weird thing just in terms of the atmosphere as a career. But I did enjoy it and got to work on some really neat things that I was really proud of. But ultimately, it's not the traditional practice of law. I wasn't really getting to work with clients in the way that I wanted to work with clients. And so I decided to go back into the actual practice of law, the more traditional practice of law. And I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to do trial, and both of my parents are small business owners. So I was like, well, I can't do energy environment, which is what I was doing before I went back into politics. And I don't want to touch anything political. So I had worked on intellectual property policy and small business policy when I was working with the Hill, and just kind of fell into the startup community in Dallas. It was honestly probably 75% timing, because the startup community in Dallas 7 years ago was a very different place than it is now. It was still really in the process of developing and finding its identity. And I came in at kind of a key moment where there were a handful of small firms that had been helping smaller early stage business owners that had grown during their time with the community. And so they were now helping mid to late stage companies, and there was really a gap in the market for someone to work with early to mid stage companies. And I loved the work, and I love the people that I get to work with, and it just really clicked. So I was really lucky in that, and I've been doing that ever since, and I don't really have any intentions of leaving.
So tell us a little bit about what you do today.
I do, if I was going to put a general term on it, it would be corporate law. But really what I do is business transactions. So entity formation, mergers, acquisitions, contract and policy drafting, corporate governance, all of the fun stuff that probably no one reads until something goes wrong. That's the stuff that I draft.
Okay. I was just looking at this speaker that I was using, and it's got this crazy manual of tiny fine print, and I immediately thought,
Yeah.
we have lawyers that require this.
That and all of the tags that say, like, don't put your hair dryer in your bathtub. We get to draft all of those things.
Exactly.
You're welcome, world, for my contributions.
And you primarily support small business, or just anybody?
Most of my clients are small to mid stage. I do have a particular segment of client that have now grown to mid to late stage companies since I've been working with them, because I've been doing this for a while, but I normally get in with clients in their earlier stages.
Okay. All right. So you can see a little bit about how people prepare or are not prepared, and what some of the pitfalls and challenges that they run into. And I guess when they are calling
Definitely.
you with some kind of challenge, or it's usually probably very reactive, something is on fire or wrong. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. I don't get a lot of preparatory or proactive calls. I do get a lot of reactive calls. And honestly, that's, I think, one of the biggest differences between working with me and working with a large firm, for example, is they're very used to clients that have all of the resources in the world, and they get to say, this is how you need to do it by the book, and this is the only way we'll accept it being done. I always joke that my clients maybe listen to like 20% of what I tell them to do in a good situation, and then we kind of like put out fires as we go along. And that's fine. There's a time and a place for that strategy, especially during COVID, because so many of them were changing business models or changing businesses completely, that my philosophy in COVID has really been, come to me after the fact, and we'll hope that it's not a fire we can't put out. I mean, there are very few instances in business law where it's a fire you can't put out. So I'm lucky in that.
Well, that's because, especially with small businesses, but during any kind of trial like this, small businesses are pivoting all the time. They're constantly shuffling.
Yeah.
And then you add this to it, and it's mandating it. So, even the people who don't pivot that way are being forced to, and they don't have a choice. So that makes sense.
Yeah,
so
100%. And I try to give them like a bullet point. Here's 5 things you absolutely should not do. We can't fix these if you do them, so don't touch these 5 things. But other than that, go forth, and we will figure it out after it happens.
Okay. All right. Well, there's a handful of common questions that I get, and it's one of the reasons why we'd reached out to you to talk, because some very common questions that I'm by no means an expert at any of this stuff. So it's good to have somebody that can give us some counsel and advice. And I realize you can't officially give counsel and advice, so I'll let you caveat with the appropriate language and legal speak before we get into the specific questions. But one of the first things I want to talk about that is a very common one that we get is LLC versus corporation. This is something that I've dealt with already, where people have asked, and I go Google and get some information, but it would be good to hear the perspective of a lawyer.
Yeah. So one of the many disclaimers that I get to make is that anything I say at speaking engagements is educational and for informational purposes only. I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, so it's always important to talk to your counsel before you make any decisions. I actually just did a video on disclaimers the other day for lawyers, and I told them they could steal that line. So if you hear that someplace else, just know that
That's
I
for
came
me.
up with it.
You got it.
Yeah. So LLC versus corporation, that is a really common question that I get all of the time. My strong default in 85% of situations is an LLC, especially for early or inexperienced business owners. And the reason being, a corporation is a really high maintenance entity. There are a lot of additional rules and regulations on how that entity has to be administered for it to give you the proper protections that it's meant to give you. And if you're not familiar with running a business, let alone with running an entity, then I find those administrative technicalities can fall through the cracks a lot of times. And then it's really just adding more to your plate than you need. Additionally, if you look at kind of the intended purpose of an LLC versus a corporation, the reason that a corporation has so many more administrative technicalities is because it's really meant to accommodate a situation where you have shareholders that are not actively involved in the business, the running of the business. And so you need that hierarchy and those formalities to protect shareholder value. That's really what they're doing. Is implementing a system of checks and balances to protect value. We don't have that in an LLC because we're assuming it's a more organic operational style and a more closely held entity, even though an LLC for most purposes can have an unlimited number of owners. So it's not necessarily a small entity, but that's really what it was for. Significantly easier to manage from an organizational perspective. Additionally, they give a lot more tax flexibility. So I find that you can grow into an LLC over time. Whereas a corporation, you have a little bit of tax flexibility, but you're a lot more cemented in your options than you are with an LLC. And also, an LLC is not a permanent pick, right? If we're in Texas, for example, and you start a Texas LLC today, that entity can be converted to a Texas corporation at a later date. So I think, start at the low volume, give yourself something easy to manage. And once you feel like you've mastered that, then convert it to a corporation if you want and need. And, there's no harm, no foul. But I just don't, I think the benefits of a corporation are overhyped in so many situations, and they're just really not giving you any additional benefit for the hassle you're going to put up with in almost all of the business situations that I encounter.
Is there a trigger point when someone might, so if, let's say I started a business and I'm using LLC, and somewhere in there, where would be the trigger point where I might consider switching?
Well, I think there are, in my mind, two kind of trigger points. Now, a CPA would obviously have a different answer, but what I'll note on that is even if your CPA were to tell you it would be beneficial for you to have a corporate tax structure, you can accommodate that tax structure. You can accommodate a corporate tax structure under an LLC. So even if your CPA says to you, you need to be a corporation, it's always important to clarify whether they just want you to be a corporation for tax purposes, which is just a tax election, or they actually need you to convert. If they need you to convert, I always get a little hesitant on that. So I'll make that note, but I'll leave the tax perspective of it up to a CPA or financial advisor. From my perspective, when you should really consider converting to a corporation is when you're going to be giving out significant equity, or you want to bring in team members and compensate them using some sort of equity. And to be fair, you can do that with an LLC. I just think it becomes more difficult to administer with an LLC. And I think it's a lot cleaner and easier to account for and technically organized with a corporation. So if you have a bunch of team members, you want to set up a stock option plan or something like that, generally at that point, I advise switching over. And then also once you start taking on significant amounts of investment. And the reason for that normally isn't even my perspective. It's normally at the request of an investor. As you deal with more sophisticated investors, they'll expect you to convert to a corporation for a wide array of reasons.
Okay, that's excellent. I think that's
But
very
absent
consistent.
those two situations, you can stay in an LLC for forever.
Yeah, that's very consistent with I think with the research I had done and makes sense, and I think it helps. Uh, I've got several listeners that are in that boat, so that will be very beneficial. I've got a bunch of other things, topics I want to
Yeah.
get into. Before I dive into those, I wanted to also get your thoughts on really what are the top issues that you run into. We kind of alluded to that earlier, is that you're reacting to a lot of challenges. What are the top issues that you see in terms of the mistakes that small businesses are making, and they're calling you saying, help?
Yeah. So I think the biggest one is documenting relationships with business partners, whether that's an investor or it's a co founder or it's an early stage team member. I think founders or business owners, especially a startup, for example, I always say they tend to trade equity like Pokemon cards at the beginning. They just like, you'll go to them and say, who's an owner? And they'll say, well, we gave 2% to our web developer like 5 years ago, but we haven't talked to him and he probably forgot. And my mom has 2%. And it's just like this whole long list of things that they have no record of and they're just kind of guessing. I think documenting relationships with your partners is one of the best things you can do. And I say that because people so frequently underestimate the importance of their business partners. And I'm sure that, you talk about this all the time, but you really do have to approach your business partner like you do your spouse. You are entering into a legally binding relationship with this person or these people. And what I see so frequently is people get into bad business partnerships and then they want to just send an email and walk away. And once those documents have been filed with the state, it's not as easy as just sending an email and wiping your hands and walking away in most instances. There are steps that have to be taken either with the state or internally to memorialize that and make sure that everyone's on the same page and you have all of the documentation you need for that. So, having those conversations and getting those documents up front, I think is super beneficial, not only to setting expectations between partners, but I hear this all the time. People say, I don't need a document because it's my best friend or my spouse or, my pastor, whoever it is. And I personally internally gauge this as the closer relationship you have with that person, the more likely it is in my mind that you will probably that's going to dissolve really quickly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this is a really old reference, but that movie Wedding Planner with J-Lo a very long time ago, where she's guessing how long the marriage is going to last based on their wedding song. And that's kind of how I feel. It's like the more you try to convince me that you don't need a document with your partner because of y'all's relationship, the more you probably need a document.
Yeah.
And but people just don't like to have awkward conversations. So I think that is really important. And then I think just contracts in general are really important. I see so frequently people get into disputes that could have been avoided because they just didn't have a contract. And contracts in an ideal world have a formal aspect to them and they cover a certain number of things. But even if you can't afford an attorney or you can't find a template or whatever it is, at least getting things in email is really helpful, because even an email has value. So I always tell people as a default, if you don't have the money or the time to get a contract drafted, I don't really accept time as an excuse, but I will accept money as an excuse. If you don't have the money to get a contract drafted, then at least follow up all of your phone calls with an email. That way you have something tangible. Even if the other side never responds, you still have tangible documentation of this was my understanding in the moment and that was communicated to you and you didn't refute it.
Yeah.
So we can assume that this was the mutual understanding.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so while we're talking about documentation, I had some other questions around that. What about HR related things? So we talk on the podcast, and I've interviewed and talked with former HR folks that I've worked with about just covering the significance and the value of HR. In a bigger business, it's super important to be able to navigate and understand, have a close relationship with your HR partner. In smaller businesses, the head person is the HR person a lot of times, and they don't exist. You see any cases or run into any problems where that's become an issue for small and mid-sized businesses?
Yeah. And I think especially during COVID, we've seen this, right? Because so many labor regulations have changed recently. We've seen extensions of the Family Medical Leave Act. We've seen additional leave requirements put in place. And so I think small businesses are trying to keep up. They were already trying to keep up with the existing regulations, and now they're, getting more stuff thrown onto the pile, and it's just really a difficult thing. I think what I tend to tell clients, just from a basic HR principle perspective, is two things. One, documentation, like you already said, is really important. So, not that you have to have significant files on everyone, but at least keeping general records of employee A showed up 15 minutes late on these days, employee A had an issue with customer one on this day, so that in the event you ever need to justify either to an agency or to the employee themselves, um, what happened or why you made a particular decision, you have some record of that. And then two, I really do think it's important to have internal policies. And those policies and procedures, I work mostly with startups. They recoil. As soon as I say policies and procedures, they're like, no, man, that's so corporate. I don't want to do it. Just let me play ping pong in the office. And it's like, cool, play ping pong. But also, policies and procedures are meant to protect the founders. They're meant to protect the business owners, or the management at least, because you have to be sure that you're applying decisions and making decisions and applying rules in a uniform manner. And it's really difficult to do that because we're all humans, and we may, we're making 100 decisions every single day. So it can be really difficult, and subconsciously or unintentionally, we can apply different rules to the exact same situation and have, no recollection or knowledge of it. So having rules, so you can point to a rule and say, no, you can't have this day off, not because I'm making a subjective decision between employee A and employee B, but because this is what the rule says. And it gives you some freedom to know and have some comfort and peace in the fact that you've consistently applied things. Yeah. I also think one of the most important things from an HR perspective that business owners can keep in mind, I firmly believe this: you are there to be a business owner, you are not there to be their friend. And I know that that is a really difficult thing to hear, especially for early business owners, because they're oftentimes working with people that they have a personal relationship with. But ultimately, once you step into that role as manager or officer or owner, you need to not text employees. You need to not, social media. I wouldn't get too involved in social media with them. And the reason is just, once again, human reality, right? How many times have each of us interpreted something via text wrong? And especially the younger or more inexperienced business owners, you have no idea what perception you're creating, especially if there are, a lot of interpersonal dynamics that can come to play. I don't need to spell them out, but yeah, don't text with your employees. I think it just sets a bad precedence. It's inevitably going to get you into trouble. You're opening a door that's very difficult to shut, and it's better to just keep it closed. And I will say the less.
Sorry. Did you mean to not text around non-work related activities, or just?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think ideally, if you could stay away from texting, that's probably ideal, because once that boundary is crossed, it can, I think, really quickly turn into personal text messages if you're not really mindful of it. Sure. But I think, especially texting in general, and then obviously, I literally say this to every business owner, I'm not joking, and I will say the polite version of it, and that is, if you are not going to listen to anything else I say, please do not sleep with your employees. Like, if there is nothing else you take away from my conversation, right. Because that is an issue that
mid-sized business, large business, that's across the board.
Yeah,
the policy
any business owner,
should adopt.
You can apply that to everyone.
Yes, I think so.
Because that does actually cause a lot of problems.
No, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. What about, and this is also in the documentation space, but my mind immediately then goes to the other cases where I would worry about needing legal protection, would be around intellectual property and non-disclosure agreements and those types of things, which kind of goes back to you're talking about equity partners, but there's also networking business to business partnerships that take place. Any concerns or thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think NDAs definitely have a time and a place, and they can be a great thing. if you are in any position where you're going to give away any of your competitive advantages, if you're going to give away any of your special sauce, if you will, then I would, consider having an NDA signed with that individual or that entity. That being said, I do think sometimes business owners overuse NDAs, and I've seen it become especially problematic in corporate strategic partnerships or in investor partnerships because they just won't sign them a lot of times. And to a lot of investors, asking for an NDA to be signed, especially in an early stage conversation, is a red flag that the entrepreneur doesn't know what they're doing. And a lot of them just won't respond after that. Now, I will add another caveat to my caveat, which is if you are talking to a big competitor of yours, so say you're a mid-sized business talking to a very, very large, like Fortune 100 or 500 competitor, I would always have them sign an NDA because there has been a really bad history of those entities saying that, oh, we want to invest in you or we want to partner with you. You go in, have meetings with them. 6 months later, they say, oh, no, we were working on this functionality all along.
Yeah.
We didn't take this idea from you. We always had that. So I think that's kind of the exception. If you're talking to someone with the resources and the market space to be able to steal something from you, then I think that an NDA is reasonable in that situation.
Yeah, makes sense. What about, let's talk about taxes. So any legal concerns and items associated with small businesses and taxes?
Tons. Well, yeah, I mean, taxes are a black hole, right? You just get lost in there. I think the most important thing any small business can know about taxes is one, before you get your entity set up, I would have a conversation with a lawyer or a CPA about tax benefits of various locations, because I hear all the time people say, oh, I started in Delaware, and you're costing your business potentially a decent sum of money every year because you're having to then pay taxes in multiple states, especially if you're not based in Delaware, if you're based somewhere else. So I think from a tax planning and strategy perspective, definitely talk to a professional before you file an entity so that you can pick the states that may be most beneficial from a tax perspective. And then also keeping on top of your taxes. I know that sounds like a really obvious thing, but you need to make sure you're doing your tax filing, especially at the state level, because if you're not doing your state level filing every year, then your entity dissolves, basically. It involuntarily dissolves. And you don't want to be putting all this work into an entity only to find out that your entity was dissolved by the state 2 years ago because you didn't file your taxes. Especially in Texas, that's super silly because our state franchise tax has such a big exemption for most small businesses. Most businesses are probably not paying anything in their state level taxes. You literally just have to do the filing every year. Mm-hmm. And if you're not doing that, then your entity gets dissolved. And I cannot tell you how many companies I have started working with, and the first thing I say is, give me all your documents, and I go and run their report with the state and the comptroller's office. And I have seen more companies than I would like that it pops up their entity was dissolved years ago, and then we have to go in and fix that. And it can be fixed, but then you have this huge gap that creates so much potential liability that really could have easily been avoided.
Makes sense. You're scaring me, but this is good to have the conversation, and so we can share with people. Ready. Let's talk a little bit.
That happens in literally every conversation.
Yeah.
There's always a point when I feel people stop listening because they're just terrified, and I've accepted that as part
maybe one of the outcomes of the interview is that people, or the podcast, is people listen and be like, I'm glad there's lawyers and I need one, right? As opposed to, I'm going to try to do it by myself. But I think there's a lot of,
if I manage to turn the tide on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things associated with, especially with taxes and LLCs and things like this, that can be intimidating. And I think one of the fears I have is people not taking action or doing nothing, putting their head in the sand and hoping it's going to be okay. Yeah. And I think there's some areas you might be all right, but there's some that could be very devastating, right? Especially when we talk about the documentation, I could see that being a nightmare, right?
Yeah.
And
there's so many things, documents are one of those things. I said most things can be fixed on the back end. And you can always go back and, draft a contract. If you didn't properly assign something and something needs to be addressed, you can draft a document for that on the back end, as long as the parties are still in a good relationship. If they're not in a good relationship, then there's not really anything you can do to retroactively account for that. And that's always kind of the game you're playing, right? Is, I'm going to wait until something goes wrong. Once something goes wrong in that relationship,
Right.
my ability to help is past at that point.
Yeah. Then you're just damage control and triage. How can I minimize the effects of it? Let's come back to the intellectual property conversation a little bit and talk about some specifics there. So copyrights, patents, trademarks, any advice or recommendation or horror stories that you've dealt with?
A ton. What's so funny is I teach business law, and this is the topic we talked about in class today. So if any of my students are listening, you already know all of this information. I'll give you extra credit if you listen, I guess, and you let me know. But I think we've seen an interesting trend in the past, 10 to 15 years probably, of the relationship with intellectual property filings changing pretty significantly for businesses. I don't think patent filings are as frequent as we have seen in previous decades. And I think that's probably for a whole host of reasons. One of the reasons is certainly a lot of the technology that we see being developed is not really novel technology. It's just a different use of an existing technology. So maybe there's an argument to be made that there's less patentable material in a lot of these companies being made. I also think it's really difficult to qualify for a patent, and it costs so much money and takes so much time. And the 20-year monopoly doesn't have the value to a lot of companies that it previously had. So, I think patents themselves are on the decline. That's certainly not for every industry. There are some industries that are holding strong to patents, and that always will, because that's the nature of the industry. But I think your average small business owner, your average startup, probably is not going to deal with a lot of patentable material. Trademarks are super important. I don't think, and I do handle trademarks and copyrights. That's not all I handle. So I think I have some intellectual property colleagues that would probably disagree with me on this point, but I don't think trademarks should be one of the first things that a company pursues. And the reason for that is, once again, resources. If you only have a set amount to put towards legal at the moment, I don't think, generally speaking, a trademark is an efficient use of those resources, considering all the things that a startup or an early stage business needs to cover from a legal perspective. Ultimately, your trademark, your ability to file a trademark isn't really going to expire. So you have some time to play with there. And also, I've seen so many companies evolve and change over time. So they launch with one name, they figure out that's not really playing right with the market, and 9 to 12 months later, they have another name or another logo, or whatever it is. And so I think sometimes you can waste those resources, and then you're sitting there with this potential IP asset that isn't really actively working for you. Copyrights, I definitely think, have value. Copyrights are easy because you get certain rights inherently upon creation, whereas to enforce those rights or to get additional rights, they need to be filed. And I'm making massive generalizations here, but copyrights, I think, are quick and easy. I think they have a lot of value. I think we're seeing unique applications of copyrights, especially in technology, as it applies to code, where we previously would have seen things like a patent, maybe. And so I think a lot of interesting things can be done with copyrights as well. I think the most important thing I like to talk about from an IP perspective is, this is like I'm beating a dead horse here with this word, but documentation. IP rights are one of those things you really need to get. You need to get an assignment and transfer of rights for anyone you have working with you ahead of time, because you don't want to bank the value of your company and your intellectual property rights and ability to use your company's intellectual property on the continued goodwill of your relationship with whoever holds that IP right. So sure. I think that even, if you had a contractor agreement or an employee agreement that had nothing else in it, My primary concern would probably be the intellectual property assignments and making sure that those are all in there and they're properly addressed. And the approach you need to take with IP assignments and documentation is going to vary pretty wildly based on what type of IP right you think you have. So, for example, conveying a trademark or a copyright or something like that is, on the scale of technicality, pretty simple. Whereas if you are thinking about patenting something, the amount of documentation and the really specific verbiage things that needs to be addressed are on a whole other scale, honestly. So if you think you're working on something patentable, I would definitely talk to an attorney ahead of time to make sure, at a minimum, even if you're not going to have them file a patent for you, at least make sure that you are preserving your ability to do that. And that if you have people working with you, you're not doing anything that may close the door to you being able to file those rights at some point.
That's a ton of information, a lot to learn really quickly. I'm glad it's recorded because I'm going to go back and listen again to make sure that I process all of that. That's extremely helpful. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit. You brought up social media and texting and things like that, but let's talk about social media a little bit. It's another area that I just kind of qualitatively look at it and be like, it sure seems like there's some legal challenges out there. I know for myself with the podcast, I try to be super careful with, who I'm tagging and what I'm doing there and making sure that they're aware and then what I'm saying and try, even on the podcast, I'm trying to be very careful about. I think one time we were talking about HR related topics and I made a Bill Cosby reference and we're thinking, can I get sued by Bill Cosby's people here? And I think so talk a little bit about the dangers of social media and what businesses might need to be thinking about in terms of being careful there.
Yeah, so I work with a number of influencer clients, if you will, and if I'm giving a crash course on social media, I say one of the most important things to keep in mind is what's behind you. So I'm actually a terrible example of this right now because I have so I'm not worried about it. But being mindful of what's in your shot is really important. So do you have logos somewhere? Do you have a Coke bottle in the shot? Are you playing music? Do you have a piece of artwork behind you that you don't have the rights to? All of that kind of stuff is really important because all of those can potentially be copyright infringement. So you need to be mindful of what's in the space. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about, well, this is fair use. If I use less than 30 seconds of a song, that's fair use. And without going into detail about why that's wrong, I will just I generally just like to say, keep in mind, fair use is a defense to copyright infringement. So you cannot claim fair use unless you are admitting that you jail-free card. And I think that's important to be aware of. A lot of the platforms have pretty decent AI that's screening content at this point to be aware of songs that may be played or videos that may be copied or things like that. But I certainly think intellectual property infringement is one of the biggest things to be aware of. And then also, of course, being careful of what claims you're making in that social media content, being aware of what regulations may apply to that. So as we saw post-Fire Festival, the FTC really took an interest in the influencer marketplace or the social media advertising space. And so if you are going to be incorporating or getting paid for some sort of sponsorship or advertisement as part of your social media creation, then being aware of what the regulations say are your required disclosures on that. What do you have to tag? What do you have to say in the video? All of that kind of stuff. And if you're a professional, that gets even more complicated because there's a whole code for doctors and lawyers and all sorts of licensed professionals about how you can go about making marketing. Like I said earlier, I literally just did a video with another attorney yesterday for a CLE on the ethical rules regarding video marketing. And there's a lot of rules out there, more rules than I would like for there to be, but there are a lot of rules. And so being aware of special regulations that may apply to you. And then, of course, being aware of special regulations that may apply if you're dealing with a particular type of product. So if you're advertising for a CBD product or a cannabis product or an alcohol product or a tobacco product or anything like that, you really need to be especially mindful of how you're doing that, what target demographic you're reaching for, and all sorts of things like that. And then also being aware of the platform's own regulations regarding that, because you have this sphere of government regulation, which is super important. But then almost equally as important, or maybe more important, arguably, is the platform itself's rules, which you find in the terms and conditions or terms of use.
Right.
And those are equally as important because, you build a YouTube channel that has millions of followers, you don't want to get demonetized, because that's going to be a really unfortunate day for you.
Sure.
So being aware of those sorts of things and the rules on the platform itself, I think, are also extremely important.
Sure. Makes sense. Makes sense. So maybe one of the last things I want to get into is for folks out there that they're listening, they go, yeah, I understand all this stuff, but I can't afford a lawyer. Right. So what's your response to that?
Well, I understand that. I think there are some things that can be done without a lawyer. I think, LLC entity filings can sometimes be managed without a lawyer. I think NDAs are a pretty easy thing to find a template for on the internet. But at a minimum, I think developing a relationship with a good attorney is at least a good thing to do, so that you can have an honest conversation about, is this something I really need to have someone handle, or is it something that I can find online or someplace that may be more cost effective? And I think the key to that question of money, especially, is finding the right service provider. There is a service provider for everyone. The big firms have their place, the mid-sized boutique firms have their place, and solo practitioners have their place. And if you're an early stage business owner, I would try exploring some solo practitioners, because they tend to have more reasonable rates. They get their client choices, so they tend to be a little more manageable to deal with. There's not a bunch of bureaucracy you're having to deal with when you're talking to them. And they tend to be in a better position to establish a long-term relationship for small business owners. Like I said, there's certainly a time and a place for a mid-size or a large firm. But I think if you're just trying to dip your toes into the water of a relationship with an attorney, a solo practitioner is a really good place to start. And there's a million and one places to find good lists of solo practitioners. Your local SCORE chapter is always a good place. They have a ton of resources. If you're in Dallas, the Dallas Entrepreneur Center. If you're in Fort Worth, Tech Fort Worth, I'm sure has a list. Most universities have a list. And so I would just, reach out to a center around you. Capital Factory has a list. Reach out to some hub of business around you, wherever you kind of gravitate towards, and just ask around, because the professionals that are around certainly have some name recognition and have some people giving their contact information out. The one note I will say on this is try to find someone that does business law. I love litigators to death. I love them because I don't want to go to trial. So I like that they're there and they're willing to go to trial. But there are a lot of people that see business law as kind of a throwaway practice area. They're like, oh, I'll just throw this onto my site because it'll be easy and I'll download a bunch of templates. And they're really not bringing you the value of business counsel, which is, half of my value to any given client is the drafting, and the other half is the advice. And my advice is worth it because I've done this a lot of times and I have a lot of experience and I've seen a lot of different things. And that's not just me, that's any experienced business attorney. My advice in a criminal case wouldn't be super helpful because I don't do criminal law. So finding someone that really specializes in business, I think, is also key, because I've seen some honestly bad advice given by general practitioners that can also land businesses in a bad position.
That makes sense. Very helpful. Maybe one of the last things I'd like to get your thoughts on are the biggest challenges or learnings that you've had personally for your career. If you could go back in time, what's the thing you tell yourself, the kind of hello younger me item that you tell yourself that would make a difference in your career?
It would make a difference in my career. I think the first piece of advice I would give myself is not trying to fit into some stereotype of what I think a lawyer is supposed to be. I think that I tried, especially really early on in my career, to develop a certain type of personal or professional persona that was what I believed a lawyer was and wasn't who I really was as a person. And ultimately, the greatest benefit and asset that any of us has is what makes us unique. And I'm always going to be a really poor imitation of someone else if I'm just imitating someone else. So, learning to capitalize on my strengths, I think, was really important. And then, um, I say this in most of the talks I do, but I think being aware of professional culture is really important. I have been sober for about 2.5 years, and being in law and being in the startup community, those are both, I love them to death, but they're both communities that have really unhealthy cultures for the most part. They put a high priority and social emphasis on drinking and on partying and all sorts of things. And it's 100% possible to be a really successful young professional without being drunk at a bar every night. You don't need to do those things or participate in those sorts of activities and networking events if that doesn't suit you or that's not what you want to do. And I see so many young professionals that don't get sober because they're afraid it's going to have an impact on their career, or they don't get help for their mental health condition because they're afraid it's going to have an impact on their career. And I know that that's not true. Like, that doesn't have to be the case. That shouldn't be an excuse. So just being mindful of that as a young professional, I think, is really important as well. And even if you don't have a problem, you can't undo what you did drunk. So, we all know that, whether we're alcoholics or not. So just be mindful of that when you go to these events, because it takes a second to undo a reputation that you've built a long time establishing, and it'll take years to build it back up. So those are probably the two primary pieces of advice I'd give myself. And then get sleep. I used to pride myself in how much sleep I didn't need,
Right.
but I need sleep.
Yeah. That's a pretty standard.
It's okay to say that.
Yeah, I think we that's pretty standard. Everybody feels like that there's some sort of masochistic, like I get a trophy if I do more and don't sleep. And
Yeah.
it's devastating to you, your performance, everything, and your health. It's a devastating thing.
Yeah.
It's a bad strategy, bad game plan. What is
100%.
what is the one thing that you wish all small business owners knew with regard to legal challenges and legal issues?
Probably the same thing that doctors wish people knew, and that is Google is not, your internet research is not going to give you all of the answers. And you need to rely on the professionals around you. You need to establish a relationship with someone that you can depend on them, because, you can come into my office and argue with me all day long about what you read online, but that's a waste of your time and money, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
So, learn to rely on the people. You've hopefully chosen good people to be around you. I always tell my clients, you're an expert at what you do. I can't do what you do. And let's just accept as a premise that you can't do what I do. And it's certainly good to be informed and enthusiastic, but you cross a line where, you're not a subject matter expert. I am, just like I'm not at what you do. As I told you earlier, I'm a terrible podcaster. I know that. I'm not going to give anyone advice on podcasting because my experience has shown me I am terrible at it. So no one wants my advice on podcasting. And the same thing with coding or video game development or whatever it is. And I think sometimes entrepreneurs feel they have to be experts at everything. And I try to be like, just breathe. You don't have to be the expert at this. I can be the expert at this, and that's okay. You can be the expert at everything else, and that'll be perfect. So yeah, that's, I guess, my one piece of advice.
Fantastic. Any other items you'd want to highlight? Anything you want to promote? Anything else you'd want listeners to know about?
I don't think so. I think I always try to promote organizations. And I know podcasts are hard because they're not always regional. You could have a worldwide or countrywide listener demographic, but I think finding a community around you of people to talk to is so important, because being a business owner is such a unique experience that if you don't have a community around you to just be able to vent is going to be, I mean, your mental stress is just going to go through the roof. I was lucky to have my mom, and she, I'm sure, would tell you all the days I've called her over the course of owning a practice and been like, I'm not doing it anymore. Like, I'm giving up. I'm tired of doing this. I'm just going to go take a cush job somewhere and I'm going to shut down the firm. And she is like, okay, you could do that, but you also know you suck at working for people, and you'll do that for like 2 months and then you'll be over it. And I don't like her in those moments, but she's totally right. And I think that's the value of community for a business owner, is making sure that you have people to give you that reality check when things get really, really hard, because they will.
Our kids have learned to hijack homeschool a little bit. Whenever they're confused about something, they go to YouTube and they look at crash courses. Crash courses are like 15 minutes on any topic you could possibly imagine. I feel like we just had a legal crash course.
Yeah, we'll probably have to go into more detail on some of those topics, but what a bunch of information in a short period of time. Incredibly valuable, especially if you have small business friends that might need this, toss this to them as well. Have a good week, folks.